Hello, this is Tammy Williams again with the West Kentucky Educational Cooperative, and we want to welcome you to Module 2 in the Part 1 session for Social Emotional Learning. Now that we took a deeper look and have a deeper understanding of the skills and competencies for social emotional learning, we're going to apply that information to dive into self-regulation. Here we have a visual analogy representing the interconnectedness of SEL and self-regulation. The roots represent the 5 competencies we learned about in Module 1, and just as a healthy root system is necessary for growing a healthy tree, the healthy development of SEL is necessary for our ability to effectively self-regulate in response to a variety of stimuli, whether it be a social situation, a disappointment we may be experiencing, an unexpected change in our routine, or a variety of conditions which could potentially cause us stress and anxiety. The branches and the leaves are the product or the outcomes of our ability to self-regulate effectively within our environment. Those clouds floating across the top, they're representing internal and external factors which may or may not impact our ability to self-regulate. Just as a cloud can serve as a positive influence on the health of a tree, such as the needed rain or protection from harmful sun temperatures, it also has the potential to negatively impact the health of the tree, like lightning, storms with high winds. So the stronger our root system, SEL, the greater the likelihood that we'll be able to respond to the internal and external factors that we may face or experience. So here we have the definition for self-regulation. It's the ability to modify our behavior to meet situational demands. It also means our ability to delay immediate gratification, internalize societal rules, and utilize attentional, emotional, and stress responses in their fulfillment of goal-directed actions. So we have that broken down into behavioral self-regulation and emotional regulation. Although they are 2 separate things, they work in conjunction of each other. Our emotions, or our ability to regulate our emotions, will often impact the behavior that we exhibit. So for behavior self-regulation, that's the ability to act in your long-term best interests, consistent with your deepest values. It's what allows us to feel one way but act another. Such as on Sunday night when we're dreading going back to work on Monday, we're dreading, that's what we're feeling, so we're thinking one thing, but on Monday morning, most of us get up and go to work anyway because various reasons. We want to provide a roof over our family's head, we want to provide food on the table, etc. And then emotional regulation is our ability to control our emotions, or at least have some influence over them. So that one requires a little more internalizing, so that being able to talk to yourself and talk yourself out of a bad mood, or calm yourself down when you're angry. And so that one requires a little more innate coping skills, as you might say. So what does the research have to say about self-regulation? Higher academic achievement when we include self-regulation components in our instructional programming. And a study done in 2003 found that self-regulation had a stronger correlation with school readiness than even our IQ or a child's math or reading skills. And then teachers can have a positive effect on student regulation, such as modeling their own self-regulation by teaching them the vocabulary to express their emotions and what those emotions feel like, providing options for responding to those emotions, such as teaching them that self-talk, providing them with tools such as calming strategies, and overall nurturing healthy relationships with students to feel safe and secure. All of this is going to be covered more in depth when we get to the zones of regulation videos. To understand self-regulation, it is extremely important that we understand the development of self-regulation from birth to adulthood. In a typically developing child, the first thing that comes is the initial behavior strategies, which involves motor skills. Then we progress to language skills and then metacognitive skills. So the initial behavior strategies generally are developed during that first year of life. Infants learn to get their needs met by use of crying, pointing, maybe moving towards or away from stimuli. They learn to use co-regulators, that's usually parents or caregivers, and use a great deal of sensory motor strategies to help them regulate. So when we pat or rock or bounce or swing or sing, or we put them in bouncers, we are actually soothing that child and teaching them how to co-regulate. Around the first birthday, we begin to develop some language strategies used along with the motor strategies for co-regulation. So a child may begin to incorporate some beginning language with the motor strategies in an effort to express their needs and wants, such as pointing or babbling prior to one-word utterances, and they continue to require that co-regulation as their language develops and their motor abilities develop. The last phase is the development of the ability to use metacognitive skills. It's at this stage in development that students are able to begin to reflect on their behavior, their environment, their emotions, etc. This level of thinking ability includes the ability to self-talk at times of stress and anxiety, the ability to understand the perspective of others that we encounter, which includes acceptance of differences, and some of those differences can include difference in value systems, our beliefs, our ideas, even choices within a social group, and also an awareness of social conventions such as conversational turn-taking, personal space, and what is socially accepted or an expected response to a specific situation. But sadly, many of our students exhibit delays in their regulation or their self-regulation development and require specific supports and strategies to promote their growth. For example, many students are lacking the ability to inhibit inappropriate motor responses to situations. This can be related to a lot of things. It can be related to neurological pathway deficits that they are experiencing. It can be related to a sensory deficit or even executive functioning deficit. So our strategies need to fit the known deficit. If it's a sensory motor strategy, you can use games to teach self-control of motor movement, more self-control in relationship to those excessive, intrusive things like hitting, kicking, biting, spitting, pushing, etc. So there are some games that we can recommend. We'll put those in the resource guide that we are going to provide you. So support and guidance, verbal techniques, things about sensitivity to certain sensory stimuli, expectations from caregivers, those are key in the development of these strategies. You can look to the Illinois Department of Education. They have a great deal of research and resources around self-regulation. So I found this visual at the Perth Children Occupational Therapy website, and they say that too often they see children reprimanded when they're not able to control their behaviors and emotions. They're expected to remain calm and happy and not get upset, nor display anger and quickly calm themselves down if they do not get angry or upset. If they can't do this, they may be referred to an OT for self-regulation difficulties. But here's the thing. Remembering that self-regulation is a developmental process. Just as we wouldn't expect a child to run before they walk, we can't expect children to self-regulate until they've experienced that co-regulation time and time again. Unless a child has had it modeled enough and their brain has developed enough, they will not achieve regulation on their own. So when was the last time you heard a 3-year-old say this? "I'm so angry, my sister hit me. I need to calm down. I'm just going to take myself to the kitchen for a drink of water and do some deep breaths." So we don't hear that out of 3-year-olds. I have 2 4-year-old grandsons. I don't hear that out of them. No, they need someone to help them co-regulate. Co-regulation begins from birth. And when babies, like I was talking earlier, when they're unsettled, we cuddle them, we rock them, we feed them, and we're helping them regulate, thus the co-regulation. When toddlers are angry, and if you've been in any preschool room or raised any children, you know that happens a lot at the toddler stage. When they're angry and they can't have the toy they want, and we can empathize with them, we can sit with them, we can get them a drink, all that is we're helping them again to regulate. That is co-regulation. When a preschooler is upset because they're not ready to leave their play dates, or it's time for a center to close down to go to larger group. Sometimes they have meltdowns and they're not coping well. They cannot regulate on their own. They cannot self-regulate. But we can listen and we can help them and teach them to maybe take deep breaths, give them some coping strategies to use, but we're going to have to do that by co-regulating, not by just telling them to do it and expecting them to self-regulate without our assistance. So self-regulation only begins to emerge around 4 to 5 years of age. And while some 4 to 5-year-olds may be able to regulate themselves, others may not be able to. And both of those are within the typical range of development. So true self-regulation is not fully established until our mid-20s. And I think back to my teenage years, and I think back to my own children's teenage years, and the times that I had to help them with co-regulation to get through a traumatic experience or something that was causing them stress and anxiety. That is a natural occurrence, but we often expect them to do that on their own and get frustrated when they're not able to do that. Even then, we often turn to others to help us feel better when we're feeling low as adults. I just did this recently. When we're, not happy, we're not quite feeling right, we often reach out to other adults to help us feel better. However, when children need our help, sometimes we're reluctant to give it. We just want them to do it on their own. We think, I've showed you once or twice. We go through the same scenario over and over, but perhaps in fear that we will stunt their emotional resilience. My son does this often with his 4-year-old. He thinks, I'm going to make this 4-year-old grow up and be a man by giving him that tough love at age 4. So I've been working on him about co-regulation. So when we ask a child to regulate themselves before they're ready, we do have a risk there of shaming them or affecting their self-esteem or even affecting their relationship with us. Remember, co-regulation needs to come first, and it needs to come often. You may not be able to help your child regulate 100% of the time. That's okay. Just know that they may not be ready to do it by themselves when you think they're ready to do it by themselves. Other factors to consider in the development of self-regulation are poverty, parenting, ethnic background, and school-based interventions. The stress relation between living in poverty has a negative impact on the neurological development or brain development of a child, which then associates with the development of self-regulation. There's research data to support the idea that the effects of poverty are cumulative and interactive. The longer the exposure to poverty, the larger the impact. And one of the largest associations is the language development. So when we think back to what we've already discussed on previous slides about the developmental phases of self-regulation from birth to adulthood, beginning with that sensory motor and then moving to language, if we have a breakdown at the language area, that will cause a breakdown from that point on. So it's important for us to consider the language development of a child. Is that child receiving special services for language through a related service through a speech pathologist? We urge you to include them at the table when you are determining services or supports or interventions. Also impacted are the cognitive skills or our thinking skills. So again, going back to the previous slides, thinking about the metacognitive skills. These will have a direct impact on a child's ability to label and understand their emotions, their ability to apply coping skills, to think through social situations that are necessary for regulation. For those children who grow up in poverty, inconsistent routines and unpredictable resources can lead them to adapt in ways that lower their self-regulatory abilities. So a child that has been raised in poverty may not be able to inhibit their behaviors such as self-restraint in certain situations because they've never had the opportunity to practice that skill. They've never had anyone to model that. And then we have things in the parenting role. What type of parent has raised this child? Although we have no control over that, understanding that can play an important part in understanding the behaviors that are being exhibited by the student. So again, has that parent been a good role model for problem-solving situations when it comes to regulating their own behaviors? And what type of control over the child has this parenting exhibited? Many children live with high levels of warmth and responsiveness and low levels of any kind of punishment or harshness, and that's going to promote a stronger self-regulation development, as opposed to those parents that assert a lot of power over their children or extreme harshness. That may include physical punishment. That is going to lead to more poorly developed self-regulation. So also another thing that we have to consider, and we don't always know this unless maybe the child's been referred for special ed and we've collected that information through social development history, is has there been some type of maternal distress during the birth of that child? So any type of mental or physical exhaustion of the woman during labor, usually caused by prolonged labor, can be characterized with the mother being dehydrated, have some altered vital signs, and even some more difficult physical problems during the labor that puts stress on the child. And then there are considerations for understanding the child's ability to regulate in lieu of the ethnic background in which they have been raised in. What are the cultural norms regarding that child's behavior? Even things having to do with gender differences across cultures can impact that child's ability to learn self-regulation. And then what school-based interventions have been provided to the student. Do you already have some form of school-wide systems of support and instruction for self-regulation embedded in your curriculum already? Are there mindfulness activities practiced within your grade levels or within the classrooms? Is there explicit teaching going on of self-regulatory strategies and self-awareness, social thinking, etc.? So all of these things are factors that come into play with either a child with positive self-regulation or a child that is demonstrating some difficulties in this area. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, are those experiences that are both positive and negative and have a tremendous impact on future violence, victimization, perpetration, and lifelong health and opportunity. As we recognize and are intervening with students demonstrating difficulty with self-regulation, we need to have our trauma lens on. Divorce, incarceration, poverty situations that we've talked about, neglect, abuse of any kind, those are stressors compounded in early childhood years that have lifelong implications. Disrupted neural development, more likely to have impaired the social and emotionally cognitive development of a child. So students coming to us with ACEs should be provided supports and interventions just as a child that has been identified as having a developmental delay. Not all of our students demonstrating difficulties with self-regulation are eligible and require specially designed instruction, but for many of them that do, we do need to consider appropriate practices, supports, etc. They will often require direct and explicit instruction. They may require us to break down their skills into smaller parts, task analyze what we're requiring of them, and set manageable goals for them to feel successful. They need us to model and provide opportunities to practice. All students need direct and explicit instruction. All students need things modeled and opportunities for practice. That is best practice in our pedagogy of instruction. However, students with special needs, more frequent opportunities, more frequent direct and explicit instruction. And here we have one of our most typical things we do to support students, and that's providing visual supports. This is an example of a possible visual support, but within the Zones materials, we're going to be looking at a variety of visuals to use with your students. What's important to remember is that we choose those visuals which are developmentally appropriate. So here we see someone has chosen to use the colors of the zones expressed with shapes as well, shapes that may be familiar to the child. And then the coping tools that are demonstrated below, they are using looks like a familiar visual such as Boardmaker. So we don't have to use Boardmaker. We don't have to use the ones that are provided in the Zones curriculum themselves. We can use whatever is appropriate and the child understands the best. We should keep those visuals consistent across settings. So if we are using a visual in the classroom and then we're using the same visual in the speech room, then if they go to the resource room or wherever they might be traveling, that they may need to have these visuals as a support system, we need to make sure that those systems are designed consistently across those settings to help that child generalize the information. And another important thing is that for the students with special needs, they often need reinforcers that look beyond natural social reinforcers. Most of these students are less successful in social situations, and so just a natural social reinforcer, they may not pick up on those cues or quite understand that. So we need to look beyond that and layer reinforcement systems that move beyond just the social reinforcer. So let's reflect for just a moment. Think about what strategies and supports have you used or are you currently using to teach self-regulation to your students with disabilities, or any of your students in the building for that matter. So think just for a moment, when we think about the components of social emotional learning, when we think about the developmental phases of self-regulation, the motor, then the language, and then the thinking skills, those metacognitive skills, are our strategies, are our supports, is our curriculum, is it reaching all of those elements? And what I didn't say earlier that I want to make sure to stress is that language is such an important component to this, that we recommend that if you are working on strategies, interventions for a student having difficulty with self-regulation, that you reach out to your speech language pathologist. Those students may or may not already be receiving that related service, but even if they're not, that speech path can give you some good strategies to use for that social language component. So I urge you to include your SLP and your OT on your team that is working on social emotional learning and specifically self-regulation. This concludes Module 2. However, before we proceed, we need to end with identifying the components of self-regulation. Those 4 components include executive functioning, sensory processing, emotional regulation, and social thinking. These components do not operate in isolation. They are dependent on one another, and if a child is having a deficit in one or more of these components, then self-regulation will be an ongoing challenge, and that student is going to require a comprehensive system of supports. This will be, we will be taking a deeper dive into each one of these components in the remaining videos for part 1 of this training series. So we'll see you in the next module.